Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Gorowski, and I will be your host for today. If you've been following along at all, February has been a pretty awesome month and pretty busy as well. We've been featuring exciting women in science, adventure, exploration, and conservation all month long. And then this week, we're also doing Let's Talk Energy Week with Ingenium Canada, as well as the Canadian Science and Technology. It's been a lot of fun. So we have many more to go today and a few more to round out next week, but I'm very excited today to be joined by our guest, Cara Clairman. Cara is the president and CEO of Plug and Drive, a non-for-profit that's accelerating the deployment of electric vehicles to maximize their environmental and economic benefits. In roughly 6 years, she's taken it from an idea to a thriving non-for-profit and a leader in the field. She has more than 20 years experience working in environmental and sustainability fields, including 12 of those years at Ontario Power Generation. She was a 2017 recipient of the Women in Renewable Energy's Woman of the Year Award, and she also drives a 100% electric Chevy Bolt. So, Cara, it's so great to have you joining us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, I know you have a little presentation prepared for us, but maybe you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and
Sure.
We're excited to learn more about what you're doing to promote electric vehicles.
Sure. So I've been working in the field of environment all my career, first as an environmental lawyer, and then later more in the sustainability area with a big electricity company. And then I started my own company, which is a not-for-profit that promotes electric cars. And so lots of different jobs over the years, but all relating to energy and the environment.
Excellent. And maybe just to get us thinking, what is it about electric cars that pulled you in?
Well, you know, I was working in the energy and electricity area, and I sort of had this idea that if we could get people to plug in cars at night, it would be a big benefit, because we have a lot of extra electricity at night when everyone is going to bed and turning all their devices off. And so we have what's called a surplus of electricity at night. And often that nighttime electricity is very clean. So for example, in Ontario, in Quebec, in British Columbia, many places around the world, the nighttime electricity is cleaner than the daytime electricity, because usually they use fossil fuels at the peak time, not at the low time. So if you could get people to plug in cars at night, you would not only just benefit the environment, you also benefit the economy, because that power is going to waste at night, and sometimes we have to run it anyway. That's the way electricity works. So for example, imagine water going over a waterfall. It runs at night the same it runs in the day, but in the night we don't have really any use for it. So we just let it go. So the great thing about electric cars allows us to use that clean electricity up, and then we can drive our cars during the day. In Ontario, if you do that, you're going to drop your emissions by as much as 90%. So it struck me as a great opportunity to both save money and reduce emissions. And so that's what got me into it.
All right. Wow. That's some excellent statistics there. I didn't realize that so much of the energy later at night, when there's less demand, is coming from more of those natural and cleaner resources. So that's a really, really important thing to take advantage of.
Exactly.
Very cool. All right. Well, we'd love to check out your presentation, and I know there'll definitely be some questions afterwards from the students. All
right, so let's get started with the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. And just remember, no questions are dumb, because this is a new area, and so everyone should have lots of good questions. Okay, so Joe, can you see my first slide?
We got you, full screen.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so as I mentioned, I run an organization called Plug and Drive, and we're out there promoting electric cars as a great alternative. And I hope by the end of the talk, you'll be convinced that Your family should think about driving electric, and when you grow up, that maybe you'll be the generation that never drives a gas car. You'll start with electric and maybe move on to fuel cell, and I'm hopeful that your generation will just skip gas cars altogether. So I'm going to take you through a couple of slides, and then we'll have time for questions. Okay, so why do electric cars make sense? Well, we all know climate change is a big problem in our society, and climate change is primarily a result of greenhouse gas emissions into the environment. And where do those greenhouse gas emissions come from? They come from three main sources. In everywhere in the world, these are the three main places that greenhouse gases come from. They come from transportation. Now, here where I live in Ontario, actually transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the province by quite a big margin, the largest contributor. And then second, you have industry, which is, you know, the making of steel and iron and cement and all the different processes we have, making cars, making everything. That's industry's contribution, 30%. And then we have buildings. So the buildings we live in, mostly commercial buildings and residential buildings, they contribute about 17%. So if we're going to actually do something about climate change, we have to tackle transportation. In fact, if we don't try to tackle the emissions from transportation, Canada and the United States cannot hit their climate change goals. So it's really critical that we look at transportation probably first or second in terms of trying to make a difference on climate change. So looking at Ontario as an example, where does our electricity come from? And, you know, it's different in every place that you live. This just shows where our electricity comes from here in Ontario. In Ontario, we have a big proportion of our electricity coming from nuclear plants. Then we have about a quarter coming from hydroelectric, that's water power. About, you know, close to 10% is renewable. That includes solar and wind, biomass, little bit of geothermal, that's heat from the ground. And finally, we have in Ontario about 10% natural gas. That's where we burn a fossil fuel natural gas to make electricity. Now, some places, some of you are in jurisdictions that have more hydro, less nuclear, more coal, but all jurisdictions tend to run in a way where the fossil fuels are what we call peaking plants, which means they run when we have the peak demand. So when everything is on, like starting around now, you know, 10, 11 in the morning till about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, that's peak demand time when everybody's either heat is on, air conditioning is on, all the computers are running, all the office buildings have their lights on, everybody is running things. And so we use that fossil fuel at the peak because it's easy to turn on and off. Nuclear and hydro, on the other hand, are very difficult to turn on and off. They run 24/7. We call that base load generation. They're the bottom provider. They provide us electricity all the time, and we tend never to turn it off because it's more expensive to actually turn it off at night than just to let it run, which of course means at nighttime we have this extra power that we don't know what to do with if nobody is running anything. You could ask the question, why don't we run some factories at night to use up some of that power? Well, we should. But, you know, let's face it, a lot of people want to work all night. So, so for the most part, things are turned off at night. So that sort of explains why we have a surplus of clean electricity at night in a lot of places. Now, I can tell you in Ontario, we have a bigger surplus than in a lot of other places because we run nuclear plants. And nuclear plants are really hard to turn off at night. It's cheaper just to let them run all the time. In some places, there's more power they can turn off at night, so they don't have as much of a surplus as we have. But that's why electric cars make a ton of sense here in Ontario, and any place that runs a surplus at night, you'll see that it makes a lot of sense. So this is just about plug and drive. What are we here for? We're here to champion electric transportation as a solution for both the environment and the economy. And we do this in a whole bunch of ways. The main thing that we do is we do education, trying to help people like you understand why is this beneficial and why should I do it. And I'm going to take you through some reasons why now, why it makes sense. So the first thing is there's a lot of myths around electric cars. And so a lot of our education work is to help people understand, really, these cars are a lot better than people think. So a lot of people think, oh, I drive too far, I can't use an electric car. Well, most electric cars can go more than 200 kilometers on a charge, and the average Canadian only drives about 50 kilometers a day. So most of us could easily adopt an electric car, but we imagine that we're going to drive a lot further than we actually do. Most of us, in fact, 80% of us only drive about 30 kilometers a day, which is so small that the range of the car is perfect for most Canadians. Now, in the US, same thing. Most people only drive about 50 kilometers a day. So it just shows that a lot of what prevents people from buying electric cars isn't actually the range, but it's what they imagine they're going to need. It's a psychological problem because we're used to a gas tank that can get us about 600 kilometers, and so we think that we need that. But the truth is, most of us don't need that. And then the other reason that we really emphasize that most people don't know is that electric cars can save you a lot of money. Electricity here in Canada is a lot cheaper than gas. Electricity costs about 25% or less than what gas costs. So if gas right now in Canada is about $1.10 a liter, electricity running your car costs about 25 cents a liter equivalent. So it's about a quarter to 1/5 the price. So you're going to save a lot of money driving on electricity rather than driving on gas. Now the benefit is a little bit less in the US because your gas is a lot cheaper than ours. But it's still less than half the price, and all the studies show that you're going to save money driving on electricity rather than gas. But people don't know this because they always hear about how expensive electricity is, but nobody's been comparing it to the price of gas. So this is another message that we really want to get through, that electricity is cheap compared to gas and will save you money in the long run. The third point we like to make is how much emissions you can reduce. If you plug in your car at night in a jurisdiction that runs on a lot of nuclear and hydro, you're going to drop your emissions by 90%, maybe more. That's true in many provinces of Canada. Now, if you're living in a state in the US that has a lot of coal on the grid, the benefit won't be quite as much. But if you can believe it, it's still a big benefit. Even if your electricity is based on coal, you're still going to get a big benefit. Why is that? People say, well, that doesn't make sense because coal plants have a lot of emissions to the environment. Well, that's true. But the thing is, a big coal plant is much more efficient than your small little internal combustion engine in a car. So you're still going to drop your emissions by around 40 to 50%, even if a lot of your electricity comes from coal. And by the way, even in places where there is a lot of coal on the grid, it's never 100% on fossil fuel. There's always some hydro, some solar, and that piece is growing in every state in the US. So every year your car gets cleaner as you drive it. Well, there's no kind of gas car that can do that. And finally, the thing that most people don't know is that there's a lot of makes and models of electric car available. Did you know that right now today in Canada there are 36 different makes and models of car available? That includes plug-in hybrids, fully electrics. There's one or two from almost every brand of manufacturer. And actually, for those of you that are in the United States, there's even more. There's more than 40 makes and models available. And most people don't know this because they've maybe heard of Tesla and maybe heard of one other, and that's it. Because a lot of dealers are not yet carrying them regularly and not promoting them. So this is information. These are the 4 key points we want you to walk away with. Save money, reduce emissions, easy to plug in, and lots of makes and models. So if you walk away from this talk with any points, these are the ones that I hope you'll remember. This is just a little bit on what we're all about. So we're out there, as I said, doing consumer outreach, teaching people about cars. We just built the world's first electric vehicle discovery center. And in that top right corner, you see a little picture of it. We have 12 different cars available for people to test drive, and they can come here and just learn. We don't sell cars. We're just showing them and teaching people, and people can do a free test drive, and then they can go to a local dealer that carries the car. We also work on policy. That's like, what are the government's programs and policies to help advance EVs, things like rebates, things like building codes and standards to make it easier for people to get an electric car. We do research to back up our work. So when I tell you we're reducing emissions by more than 90%, that comes from some research that we've done. So we're busy always backing up our numbers with good research. And of course, we partner with lots of companies who help us do what we're doing. So here's some pictures from our Discovery Center. We know we're the world's first facility like this, but we know now there are a few others that have opened or are opening. We heard about one in Portland, Oregon that recently opened, and we know now there's one opening in the UK. So we know that it's a good idea when others are trying to do it. As you can see from these pictures, we have a Tesla here on display. We have lots of people coming to visit us. We have a wall of history. And I hope if you're ever in Toronto that you come and visit us. It's a great place for adults, for kids. It's like visiting the Science Center, and your parents can take a test drive of any car they like. We have loads of fun. We also host a lot of special events and parties here. We have a special program for kids that we run. So I hope you'll take the chance if you're ever visiting or you happen to live in Toronto to come over and see us. We also have an online store because we know it's hard for people to find a charging station, and how are they going to figure out which charging station they should buy for their car. So we have an online store with all sorts of makes and models and information on home charging stations to help you choose, buy, and install the right charger for you. All the cars that are for sale right now come with a cord set in the trunk to plug into a regular 110 outlet. And when I say 110, that's like the same plug you plug your computer into at home or a lamp. So that's just a regular outlet. You can plug any electric car into that outlet today and it will work perfectly fine. You don't even need a special charger. Now, the thing about that though is it's kind of slow. If you want to charge more quickly, a lot of people will buy a home charging station. And this is what we call a level 2 station. And by level 2, we mean it's a bit faster than a level 1, a regular outlet. And level 2 is like the plug that you have at home to plug in your stove or your dryer. So it's a twice the voltage of a level 1 charger, of a 110 outlet. And so your car will charge more than twice as fast. And so a lot of people with a 100% electric car, like a Chevy Bolt, or a Tesla, or a BMW i3, or a Nissan Leaf, they'll buy this because they want to charge a little more quickly. You could charge your car from totally empty, and remember, most of the time you're not coming home totally empty, but let's say you did, in about 4 to 6 hours. So you plug it in at night, you charge overnight, you get up in the morning with a full tank every morning. Much more convenient than having to go to a gas station where you got to go there and stand for 5-10 minutes and pay. This, you just click for 2 seconds when you get home. It charges overnight. You're ready to go every single morning. So it's super convenient, and these stations make it a little bit quicker, especially if you have the kind of lifestyle where you might come home for a few hours and then you need to go out again at night. So I just want to spend a few minutes on some really interesting statistics that I think you guys will understand where I'm coming from on this. This study happens to have been done in Toronto, but it could represent any city in the world. Toronto is a really big city with thousands of cars, obviously. We have more than 4 million people in the greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And so we wanted to find out, how do people who drive gas cars feel about electric cars? We hear lots of anecdotes in the news, and what people think, but we want to know what they really think. And then we also surveyed EV owners, so people who've already bought EVs, and find out what they think about their car. So we commissioned a study that was done by a professor. So it's a very statistically valid study where they make sure they ask the questions in all the right ways so you don't get kind of a skewed answer. And here's what we found. We asked gas car owners, why did they not choose an electric car? What were they worried about? And they said the number one reason they said was they thought that they believed that EVs were too expensive, and so they didn't choose it. Whereas the EV owners, when we asked them why did they choose an EV, they said they chose it because it's good for the environment. So you find out quite a bit about those early EV adopters. They really care about the environment. And still, most people, which is gas car owners, still believe EVs are too expensive. Now, this is a myth, but this is really important for us to know that people think this. And the reason they believe this myth is because they've heard a lot about Tesla. And of course, Tesla is a very expensive car, but there are lots and lots of cars at the low price point, and in many jurisdictions, there are also EV incentives. So in many states in the US and in 3 provinces of Canada, Ontario, Quebec, and BC, you get a rebate back when you choose an EV. And what we found too is nobody knew about that. They thought the cars were too expensive, and they didn't know about our incentive programs. And I have a feeling you'd find the same thing in other US states or other provinces. So it's really important for us who are doing education to go, okay, we have to help people understand the rebates that are available, and also that there are lots of cars at the lower price end. You don't have to buy a Tesla to be able to buy an EV. The other thing we found out is that pretty much everybody agrees that climate change is a problem. We asked people, do you believe climate change is real? Do you believe it's a problem that we should do something about? And pretty much everyone we asked, gas car owner or EV owner, they all said yes. They believe it's a problem and we should do something about it. Where they were different was the gas car owners, a lot of them did not believe their car choice made any difference to climate change. Whereas the EV owners said yes, they did think their car choice would make a difference. And so that teaches people like us, and also your teachers and all educators, we have to help connect the dots between the car choice and emissions and tell people, yes, your individual car choice makes a big difference to climate change. And if you want to do something about climate change, this is something you could do that makes much more difference than pretty much anything else you could do in your personal life. You can't get anywhere near these emission reductions with light bulb changes and insulation and other things. The only other thing you could do that really could come close to the emission reductions of a car is to give up a car altogether, which, face it, a lot of people will not do, or to give up flying in planes. And those are big sacrifices that most people aren't willing to make. So changing your car from gas to electric is the #1 thing that your family can do to reduce their emissions if you're looking for something to take action, a way that you can make your contribution. So here in Ontario, we have a goal to increase EV sales to 5% of new car sales by 2020. We're just at 1% now. So it's a big challenge to get there, but we think it's possible. And how are we going to get there? We have to do 2 main things. #1, we have to improve consumer knowledge. Consumers still don't know enough about these cars. They don't know how much environmental benefit there is, the cost savings. They don't know enough about all these things I've been talking to you about this morning. The second thing is there's still a lot of range anxiety, which is this idea that people are afraid they're going to be out there driving and they're going to run out of electricity and there's going to be nowhere to charge. This is something we have to help people get over. There's 2 things we need to do. We need to explain to people most of the time they're going to plug in at home at night and they're not going to have a problem. And then the other thing is we still do need more public charging stations and workplace charging stations to give people comfort that they don't have to worry when they go out you know, driving around. They're so used to seeing gas stations on every corner, and they don't see these EV charging stations yet. They're actually a lot of them all around, but they don't know that because they're small and often behind buildings or in underground lots. And so we have to do a better job of showing people where they are. So I'm just going to finish off with a few more interesting facts about how we're doing in terms of car sales here in Canada, and what we need to do to hit that 5% goal. And that's a similar goal in a lot of different places. So you can see here by the end of 2017, we're in the first quarter of 2018. In Canada, we're getting really close to 50,000 EV sales Canada-wide. Now, that's a pretty good number considering up until last year, there really were only a few makes and models available. Now we're up to, as I said, 36 makes and models. It's getting easier and easier to get an EV. And so the projections of a research group called Navigant, a very, very well-respected research group, says that we are going to hit those targets and even do better than them by 2020, because every year the sales are doubling. Here in Ontario, our sales doubled in 1 year, and we're assuming if we continue on that same path, we should hit some pretty big numbers by 2020, and that's true all across the world. So EVs are no longer a question mark if they'll succeed. Now the debate is just when they'll succeed. So it's a pretty exciting time for those of us in this space. Just quickly to say, you know, when you're a not-for-profit, and you kids will learn, you know, what kind of, you know, work you might do in the future. When you work for a not-for-profit, you rely on the support of other companies that believe in what you're doing. And this just is give you an idea. We're supported by a bunch of electricity companies, banks, automakers, and folks who make charging stations, and we couldn't do any of the stuff that we're doing without them. I'm pretty excited about the future of electric cars, and we have plenty of reasons to be optimistic. We have countries banning gas cars. We have automakers like Volvo and GM and BMW saying they're going to electrify every make and model that they make. Not some of their cars, all of their cars. And this will take time, but it's going to happen. And it's pretty exciting now. We see the CEO of Shell, which is one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world, saying his next car will be electric. When that starts happening, you know the world is changing. I'm optimistic that you kids, when you learn to drive, you're going to drive electric cars, not gas cars, and we're going to change the world in one generation. So that's it for my presentation. You see here my email address, my Twitter handle, and our 1-800 phone number. You guys reach out to us anytime if you have questions, if you want more information, you want to follow us on Twitter. We'd love to see young people getting excited about the future of electric transportation. So I'm going to stop my screen share now so you can see me, and then we can have all your questions.
All right, you're back.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Cara. That was incredible. Just some really good points and some really good information, and I really enjoyed some of those headlines you shared at the end, because the future is looking really good, and it sounds like there's a lot of positive movement in the right direction. So obviously a big thank you for everything you're doing to help guide that and steer us in the right direction.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's meet some of our classrooms. So we have a group of classrooms in Canada and the US joining us today. Why don't we start off in Mississauga today? Let's go to a grade 6 classroom. So I bet you they're studying electricity this year. Mrs. Holloway's class in Mississauga. Let me turn your microphone on. How are we doing, grade 6s?
How are we doing, grade 6s?
Hello!
Hi. Hi.
Hello.
All right.
All right.
Got a question.
Of course, right at the moment we're live, she passes me.
That's tough.
Why is it silent? I need to make this up.
Okay, because
Do you
they're
guys
watching.
have a question, Mrs. Holloway's class?
Yeah, we put it in the chat.
Sujel, come on up.
It's in the chat. Okay. Yeah.
Skills.
Sujel, come on up. You can ask it live.
Yeah.
Yeah, asking live's always better.
Do I type it? I type it?
No, talk. They can
Oh.
see you.
Go ahead.
If
Go ahead.
the CN tower has an electric rod, a metal rod at the top, and a bolt of lightning can power a town for a year, a city for a year, why can't we collect that electricity and turn it into electricity we can use?
That's an interesting idea. You know, there is a way of electricity. I'm not sure about from lightning. I have to say that's not something I know a lot about. But I'll give you another example where we can collect electricity in a big battery that we can save up. For example, let's say we take electricity overnight that we're wasting, and we can put it into a big battery, and then we can save it for the daytime when we need it the most. So that's what we call energy storage. And it's not just batteries. It can be in batteries. There are other kinds of storage called hydro store, where we store it in big bags of water under a lake. You can also store it in flywheels. There's a lot of ways to store electricity, and it's important because, you know, we use a lot more electricity in the daytime than at nighttime.
All right, let's meet another classroom. Let's go to Taylorville, Illinois this time with Mrs. Dorf's group. And it may be grade 8s, but there may be some more joining them today. Let me turn their microphone on. How are we doing today?
We're good. Okay.
That's good. You guys have a question for Cara about electric cars?
Okay. How are you gonna get the battery? Okay, how do I say this? Say the battery goes bad, and it's gonna cost a lot of money to get that replaced.
Right.
So how is that gonna be better than
Okay. That's a good question. That's a very, very good question that you have. And just so everyone can hear it, it's just about what are we going to do with all these batteries maybe when they're no good for the car anymore. Does that sort of summarize what you meant?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, that's an important question. And what we're finding is the batteries are lasting quite well in these cars, but like you point out, the cars are still pretty new, so we don't really know what's going to happen with them. Now, the Prius, which is a hybrid, they've had small batteries in them for a long, long time, and they're basically the same kind of battery. So we know how well they're going to last. And what we're finding is they are lasting about 15 to 20 years. But at some point, they are going to not be useful for the car anymore. We're going to have to figure out what to do. You know, they're not actually that different from the batteries in our phones and in our computers. They're just bigger. So we do actually have ways of recycling those batteries, and most, about 90% of what's in there can be recycled. Another thing that we're going to have to do is something we call reuse of batteries. And so this is a pretty cool project that's going on actually in the United States. What they're doing is when the battery's no good for the car anymore, but it still has a lot of power in it. So let's say it has 60% or 70%. It's not good for driving, but it's still good for something. And so what they're doing is they're taking all these batteries out of the cars and they're snapping them together, and they're using them for what they call backup storage. So instead of using diesel gas or fossil fuel to back up a hospital or a school, they're using these batteries, a big chunk of batteries all together. So the batteries are going to go into this secondary use, and then they're going to be recycled. So they do have a lot of plans underway to use these batteries, but like you point out, right now we still don't really know. We're not recycling them yet because they're too new. We don't have any coming out of the cars yet.
All right, great question. Let's jump to another classroom this time. Let's go to Grand Junction, Colorado, some grade 8s with Mrs. Ragsdale. Let me turn their microphone on. How are we doing today, grade 8s?
Good.
All right, who's got a question?
Okay, Emily, jump up.
Why did you decide to do this work, or this type of work, and study?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. So why did I decide to do it? So I worked for a big utility, and a utility is a company that makes electricity. So I was working in their sustainability. I was what they call the VP of sustainability, which was running all their environmental programs. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about ways that a utility that makes electricity can reduce their emissions, can do good things for the environment. But of course, a big company is also always thinking about ways to save money. So I think about both those things. And so while I was working in the utility, and this particular utility makes a lot of electricity from nuclear power. So we had a lot of surplus electricity at night. And I had this idea about, like, if you could plug cars in at night and use that wasted electricity and also reduce emissions, it seemed to me like a winning idea. And so I really thought, I want to do something to do with this. And I went to the president of the company and I said, I have this really good idea. I want to do a project on this. And I was really lucky that he supported the idea. And so it started out, I was doing a little project on electric cars in the company I was working for. And after a couple of years doing that, that's when I decided to take it outside and do a project, a big, sort of a bigger idea where I would get lots of different companies supporting the idea rather than just one. So it sort of was a gradual thing, but I was lucky to have the support of a very supportive boss originally. That's how I got it started.
All right, great question. Our final group is joining us from Canada. They are in Ottawa. They're a grade 6 class, so I'm going to guess that they're studying electricity as well. And they're with Mrs. Kraveski. So let me turn your microphone on. How's it going in Ottawa today?
Great.
All right, who's got a question?
So who invented the electric car?
That is a great question. If you can believe it, I should flash back to a slide that has our history wall. But if you can believe it, actually, electric cars were invented in 1830. So electric cars have actually been around for close to 200 years, not quite, a little less, about 180 years. And most people think that it's a new thing, but it isn't a new thing. The first cars were actually electric with a really tiny little battery. They could only go about, 5 to 10 miles or 20 kilometers because this battery was really small. But that was before gas cars were invented. And so, and most people lived in little villages, so they didn't travel that far. I can't remember the name of the fellow who invented it. But they were invented early days, and these were the first cars. And in fact, it wasn't until around the early 1900s that gas cars kind of became more popular than electric cars. And the reason that happened is originally gas cars weren't very popular because you had to crank them with a crank, and a lot of people did not like doing that, and it was very dirty. You used to get your hands dirty. And so electric cars were nice and clean. You didn't have to touch anything. And then when automatic starters came, when they invented the automatic starter and the spark plug, that's what changed everything. Then suddenly it was easy to start a gas car, and that's when gas cars could get bigger range. And so gas cars took over from electric cars at that time.
If only we could go back in time and change them. Well, we can probably squeak in another question or two. So if there is a classroom with a question, give me a big wave at the camera. I'm watching for you. And we'll visit again. So there we go. Let's go back to Mrs. Ragsdale's class. I see lots of waving.
So what would you do if you wait, is it on?
Yep.
Okay. What would you do if you're driving across the country? You said it can go roughly 200 kilometers on one charge.
Right.
What would you do? Like the country is thousands. What would you stop
Okay.
at night or?
So yes, so it's a question I get a lot about driving across the country. So I'll give you two answers. Okay, first, almost nobody drives across the country. So it's the kind of thing that people do very rarely or once in their life. So what I tell people is, like, don't buy the car for the one time you might take a really far trip. buy the car for the 99% of your trips, your commute, everything that you do every day. And then if you take a big trip, you rent a car, you do something else. Because to be honest, the infrastructure is not ready for driving across the whole country. The second answer is they are building charging stations to make a cross-Canada trip and a cross-US trip. Actually, it's easier to get across the US right now than across Canada. Canada has some pretty big gaps still in it, but the federal government is funding a network of charging to make it possible to drive across Canada. But at this time, I would say, you know what? If I was driving across Canada, I would want to drive a plug-in hybrid. Now, a plug-in hybrid has a big battery, so you can go about, let's say, 80 kilometers on battery, and then it switches to gas. So that if there's a gap between charging stations, you're going to be okay. So I think in the early days, we have to sort of say, you know what? We can't choose our car for something we might do once a year or once in a lifetime. We got to choose our car for the thing we do every single day. And so many families in Canada and the US have 2 cars. So you say, hey, you have one electric car and you have a gas car or a plug-in hybrid for those long trips. But it is a good question. I have to tell you that a lot of news people ask me that question, and it does weigh on people's minds because Canada is a big country. And of course, the United States is big too, but the reality is most of us actually don't drive too far. So it's more of a theoretical thing.
All right, great question and a great answer for it as well. And let's visit our class in Ottawa one more time because I saw a lot of hands there. So let's see if they have a question.
Hi. Do electric car sales happen in other countries beside Canada and the United States?
Good question. How are the sales in other countries? And by the way, love your outfit. Go Canada in the Olympics. It's pretty amazing. The country with the best sales for electric cars is Norway. And actually, interesting, I'm commenting on your Olympic outfit, they also have the most medals in the Olympics. Norway is a northern country like Canada, and the reason they have such good electric car sales is they took a different approach than we took. In Canada, we're giving incentives for people to buy electric cars. What they did in Norway is they put a giant tax on gas cars. So actually, it's cheaper to buy an electric car there than it is to buy a gas car. And so their sales are like 30% electric cars. The next best place to buy an electric car is California, where they have really good incentive programs, and they're up to about 5%, but still nowhere close to Norway. And in Canada, we're coming up the rear at about 1.5%, and we're hoping we're going to hit 5% by 2020.
All right. Well, great questions. And since we have our group in Illinois, we'll just double check one more time to see if they have another question.
Yeah, we have another question.
Of course.
Hi there.
Shouldn't there be a way to like recharge the battery with the turning of the wheel and that generate power?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I had a hard time hearing you.
Shouldn't somebody find like a way to, if they can, the turning of the wheel can generate power to charge the battery?
Oh, that's a neat idea. Well, actually, there is a little bit of that. We call it, it's not quite from turning the wheels, but it's called regenerative braking. And what happens is when you slow down in an electric car, it does take the energy from those spinning tires in the brakes and put it back into the battery. And it's actually pretty cool because on my dashboard, I drive a 100% electric car. On my dashboard, the screen will show me when the power is going into the battery from my brakes and when the power is going out of my battery. And that's actually why city driving, you can get a lot more range in an electric car than highway driving. Because of course, with city driving, you're doing stop and go, you're slowing down a lot of times for lights. And so you're constantly putting electricity back into the battery and saving it there, and then you can get a further trip. In fact, in Toronto, the right downtown is kind of downhill from where I am in the north part of the city. And if I leave from where my office is and go straight downtown, I can arrive downtown with more power in my battery than when I started. So it's pretty cool. So you're right, it exists, and it's a good idea.
All right, great. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to ask you what you thought about seeing that Tesla orbiting the planet the other week.
I guess I thought it was a good marketing for the car, but I thought it was kind of funny. Actually, I am really looking forward to that Tesla Model 3. If any of you do follow Tesla, you'll know that, you know, of course, the Teslas that are out right now, the Model S, as in Sam, and the Model X, those are very expensive cars. They're like anywhere from $100,000 to $120,000 Canadian, but 80,000 US dollars. But the new one that they're coming out with, the Tesla Model 3, which we don't really have yet in Canada, but I know it's landed in a few states, that one is going to sell closer to 35,000 US dollars, 50,000 Canadian dollars. And that's going to be a car that a lot more people can afford. And I think it's going to change a lot of the conversation around electric cars and this idea that they're too expensive.
All right. Well, Cara, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. That was a great hangout.
Pleasure.
I think the students learned a lot. You had some great points, and you know, it's really great to hear these stories and to hear that there's so many groups pushing for this to be successful, and that, you know, it might not be too much longer before it becomes more regular and something that we're all just used to, and we forget about those other alternatives.
Right. You folks go home and talk to your parents about their next car.
All right. Well, classrooms, thank you so much. Those questions were great. I'm going to turn the microphones on, give you a chance to say goodbye and thank you, and then we're going to sign out for today. So here we go. Microphones coming on. Nice and loud.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for hanging out today. You guys enjoy your weekend, and look forward to seeing you in other hangouts. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.